So now we're moving on to our final panel of the day, the way forward, policy responses to fentanyl analogs and drug control. Following this panel, we will have a short sort of final message, so stay for that as well. And with that, I will pass this along to Kanya Bennett. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. We appreciate you joining us, those who are tuning in for this afternoon's portion, for those of you who have been with us throughout the day. It has certainly been a very thoughtful, very engaging, very deliberative discussion. And I have the honor of closing the panel, the symposium out with this panel on the way forward. Again, my name is Kanya Bennett, and I'm a senior policy counsel and legislative coalition manager at the Bail Project. The Bail Project is a national nonprofit that has been operating since 2018 to advance criminal, racial, and economic justice by paying bail for people in need. As part of the Bail Project's policy team, I am pushing systemic reforms that will steer states and localities away from wealth-based detention. Obviously, the Bail Project is concerned with all things bail, all things pretrial, and the people impacted by these practices, including those who are being jailed because of our reliance on punitive approaches to fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. Today's symposium has explored all that is wrong with this punitive approach. And as I shared at the start of today's symposium close, we want to figure out how we move forward. I have the privilege of moderating a conversation about this way forward and what policy responses should look like and what they shouldn't look like as we steer the federal government away from class-wide scheduling of fentanyl analogs and towards a public health approach. I'm going to introduce our panelists as I raise questions with them. We have a great lineup, and I know we will have a very thoughtful conversation. Patricia Richman, who is one of the symposium conveners, is on this panel. So want to give her a special acknowledgement for all that she has done, along with Grant Smith of Drug Policy Alliance and our friends there, Doug Berman and others at The Ohio State University, for giving us this platform today and for allowing us to have this very important conversation. So with that, I am going to raise a first question with Jasmine Budnella, who is the drug policy coordinator for the New York-based Voices of Community Activists and Leaders, or Vocal New York. At Vocal New York, Jasmine leads state and city campaigns to end the drug war and to win policies that promote harm reduction and public health. She also facilitates End Overdose New York, which is a coalition of stakeholders from across the state who have been impacted by the overdose crisis. Jasmine, the conversation that we've been having today is not new to you. In New York, you are pushing back against the prohibitionist approach to fentanyl. You are instead asking state lawmakers to advance a health-based approach to fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. And I know that there's a lot that we can learn at the federal level from what you have been experiencing in New York. Can you talk with us for a few minutes about what lessons we can learn from your work there in the state of New York?
Sure, thanks. And super pumped to be here. Thanks again to Patricia and Grant for pulling this together. Really excited to be here. So yeah, just like a quick rundown of how we were able to push back against the state scheduling fentanyl at the state level in the Controlled Substance Act. One is like New York often is said a beacon of hope, right? Like a beacon of progressivism, when really it's like, you know, the Rockefeller drug laws were born in New York, and our governor has, you know, continuously fought back against evidence-based solutions. So for the last 4 years in our budget, the governor has proposed to schedule fentanyl analogs as a response to the overdose crisis, which is surging across the state of New York, really surging now during COVID. So for the first year, we were able to fight back and really work with the Senate and the Assembly to say, hey, we can't do this. But for the second year, we, you know, which was the same year that New York State had passed historic bail reform legislation, but we were also running our campaign alongside what was happening at the federal level. So we knew that it was both a narrative fight, a policy fight, and a political fight. So the narrative piece was that we were, you know, building with our coalition, the stakeholders from across the state, that is both rural, urban, suburban, families who have lost their loved ones, people who currently use drugs, service providers, of saying, hey, prohibition got us here, and we cannot continue to oil the drug war machine as we move forward, because we know what's going to happen. And, you know, the beginning of this panel, I was really pumped, or not panel, symposium, to see how you all laid out that, like, if we schedule fentanyl, we know that mass incarceration is going to increase. We know that evidence-based solutions and people's ability to use them are going to decrease, and overdoses are going to continue to rise. So what we did was pulled together our legislative leaders, and we just so happened to have a few of them who voted against the Rockefeller drug laws in 1973 and voted to repeal them. So we brought them in to say, hey, this is the next level, and you all fought back in the beginning. We need you to fight back hard now. And essentially what the governor was proposing was that the Department of Health would have unfettered access to schedule any drug, right? As well as was proposing to schedule 30 analogs, including salts. And we were able to really galvanize not only these legacy legislators who have been against the drug war since its real inception, and bring together the next level of new legislative champions who were standing on the shoulders of these legacy electeds to say, like, we cannot move forward in, like, essentially, we cannot move forward to drug war 2.0. What we need to do instead is pass all this legislation, which is overdose prevention centers across the state of New York, which is universal access to medication-assisted treatment, which is universal access to harm reduction tools, right? And we need to realize that criminalization and prohibition is why we're in this mess to begin with. And so we didn't win, but we didn't fully lose. What we won, right, was that we didn't have, the Department of Health didn't get unfettered access. What we didn't win is instead of, well, partial win is instead of 30 analogs being scheduled, they scheduled 13 that was alongside of what the federal government did. And so the other really big narrative part is like bringing together that all of the voices as well as legislators is that not only this year did the governor not propose any criminalization tactics at all, which was a big, I think, narrative win, as well as some policy and advocacy wins, is that now, you know, we're like in an election cycle as well as just had one, and everybody is, not everybody, a lot of people are talking about we need to be moving to decriminalization. We need universal access to medication-assisted treatment. We need universal access to harm reduction. We need overdose prevention centers. We need to like move away from treating people with criminalization and harm and treat them with care and compassion. So, I was just talking about this today earlier, is that we had local, hyper-local news saying the governor is taking a prohibitionist approach to the overdose crisis. So like that, I was like, wow, like the Albany Channel 7 is talking about it in this kind of way. So I would just say that like framing in my brain about like how we are able to bring together multiple stakeholders, hold the spaces of both the narrative, the policy, and the politics, as well as looking at our champions, which many of them have been on this panel today, that can inspire new leadership inside both, you know, the Congress, inside the Senate, as well as local governments.
Thank you so much for that, Jasmine. I was busy taking some notes. There's so much to react to. And I think that it makes the most sense to turn to our colleague, Sakira Cook, who's at the leadership conference to do some of that response. You talked about sort of how your work there in New York State was happening in parallel to what was, you know, going on at the federal level. And Sakira Cook is the senior director of the Justice Reform Program at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Leadership Conference Education Fund. She was previously the legal fellow at the Open Society Foundations. At the Leadership Conference, reference Sakira leads coalition work on policy that touches every aspect of the criminal legal system. And we are very appreciative to have Sakira's leadership in this space. Sakira is a partner with all of us on so many things, and obviously knows, from overcriminalization and overpolicing to increased prosecution and mass incarceration, what we have seen time and time again being used, the tactics and tools of the criminal legal system, just how this is going to have impact if we stay this course with respect to fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances. So Sakira, I want you to talk a little bit about how class-wide scheduling perpetuates these failed tactics of the war on drugs. We heard a bit from Jasmine on what that looks like in New York. What does it look like at the federal level?
Well, thanks, Kanya, for that question. And thank you again to Grant Smith at DPA and Patricia at the Federal Defenders for bringing us all together to talk about this issue. For the last several years, we've been pushing back on what we believe to be a return to the old ways of the past, I would say 40 years, that this war on drugs has been in place. If we continue to approach drug use and abuse as a enforcement through the lens of enforcement and criminalization, we will continue to perpetuate what we have seen with crack and powder cocaine, what we have seen with other drugs, which is that Black and brown people and other people of color will disproportionately bear the brunt of incarceration as a result of prosecution and a focus on criminalization versus public health for these types of issues. And the mere fact that we believe that we can continue down this path and have a different result, in my view, is the definition of insanity. We've tried this over and over again for however long we've been, quote unquote, fighting this war on drugs, and it hasn't made us any safer. It hasn't led to lower use rates. It hasn't led to decreased incidents of drug use and selling and abuse. And so if that hasn't worked, why do we continue to take the same approach? Why do we continue to do the same things over and over again? If not for what Prosecutor Mobley said, which is that the entire framework for how we approach drug use in this country has been built on, from our perspective, systemic racism, has been built on an understanding that our sole goal was to put Black and brown people in prison. That is the sole goal of the criminal legal apparatus in this country, especially at the federal level. Almost half of the federal prison population are people there for drug offenses. That is not by accident. That's by design because of the ways that we have set up our system. So class-wide scheduling of fentanyl will only continue on the path that we have said in the last 10 years or so that we are trying to move away from. We have said we no longer believe that long sentences, mandatory minimums in particular, are the right approach to achieve public safety. We have said that. We have worked to address those things. Both Republicans and Democrats have said that they agree that we have taken that this approach does not work and it does not lead to safer communities and safer environments for everyone, but it has just led to more and more people behind prison and more Black people behind prison. So if we actually believe that, if we actually, want to take a different route, we should no longer find excuses for using age-old adages around the war on drugs, around our need to use criminalization and enforcement as a mechanism and driver of public safety today. We shouldn't be doing that in 2021. And so what we will see and continue and have seen is prosecution and incarceration, which have never worked, again, as proper solutions to public health issues, will, continue to be on the rise. We'll continue to see an overuse and abuse of mandatory minimums, which serve no goal other than perpetuating the expansion of the criminal legal system, the expansion of the prison system on the backs of Black and brown individuals, especially because of the way that policing and over-policing happens in this country, where police resources are predominantly pushed to predominantly people of color neighborhoods. Fentanyl analogs have led to mandatory minimum sentences in the US for years, for decades, but supply has only increased, it hasn't decreased. So this isn't even working to stop the influx of the drugs into the country. And tends again reflect the tendency to treat this opioid problem as a deserving of criminalization of only certain communities instead of the compassion and dignity and treatment that my previous colleagues just talked about. So, I mean, we know that it is the case that many drug users or sellers do not actually even know, quite frankly, that the composition of the drugs that they are selling, that they are selling heroin, many of them do not even know that the heroin that they are selling is laced with fentanyl, that it has fentanyl analogs or any analog of fentanyl inside of it. They don't know that, but they, are charged with sentencing enhancements that again lead to mandatory minimum sentences. This is supported by US Sentencing Commission data, showing that the majority of those prosecuted for fentanyl trafficking did not have clear knowledge that they were trafficking the drug. Class-wide scheduling will not address this issue and will therefore just subject more individuals, as I said before, to involvement within the criminal legal system that will have consequences far beyond just that initial conviction. And we, again, have seen this played out over and over and over again. When I think about the hysteria, and I use that word, both not lightly, but I use that word intentionally because it's not to say that we all should not be concerned about the drug abuse crisis. We all should be concerned about drug use and abuse and overdose deaths. Absolutely. We absolutely should be concerned about that. But the hysteria, unfortunately, because of that concern, it turns into hysteria that turns into policymaking from our perspective that has continued to use mechanisms and solutions from the past, from the time where, to some extent, people did know better, but a time where many did not know better. But now we know better. Now we know, we have data, we have research, we have proven solutions in the opposite direction that we know we can use, but we continue to want to go to enforcement. And we have to ask ourselves why. We have to ask ourselves, is continued prosecution, increases in prison incarceration, increases in the numbers of people going to prison for trafficking in drugs that may or may not be laced with fentanyl or an analog, if that is going to reduce the amount of fentanyl coming into the country, the amount of other drugs coming into the country, is it going to reduce overdose deaths? And we've seen it hasn't worked. It doesn't. It does not do that. But the things that do work, and my colleague talked about this earlier, that's what we should be focusing on. So from our perspective, to continue down the road of criminalization, of over incarceration, of a approach to drug use and abuse in America that is rooted in, again, enforcement and, does not think about how we invest in other alternatives, how we invest in communities, in community-led solutions, and from a public health perspective, is the wrong way to go. It will only lead to what we have seen over the last 3 or 4 decades with respect to the impact of the war on drugs on Black and Brown people specifically, but on our society as a whole.
Thank you so much for that, Sakira. And yes, we definitely want to circle back to what some of these public health approaches may look like. I was listening and paying close attention to what you shared as well. And this sense of us knowing better as a society, as a country, in terms of how we need to respond to drug use is, I think, exactly why we now need to bring Jason into this conversation. You also talked about this being a bipartisan issue, that there are people across the ideological spectrum that know that we need to do better, and that if we continue to criminalize drug use, that we are going to find ourselves in the picture that you so properly provided us. So Jason, let's talk to you now, and let me introduce you before I have you offer some thoughts. So you're the director of the Rule of Law initiatives at the Due Process Institute. You're promoting the organization's policy agenda on Capitol Hill. Prior to joining DPI, we all had the pleasure of working with you as Vice President of Legislative Affairs for Freedom Works. And, you know, in both capacities, you've been a part of this right-left collaboration to reform our criminal legal system. This push to end the war on drugs and the many harms that have come from it is owned by a diverse constituency. As I said, both progressive and conservative advocates do not want to repeat the mistakes that we have used previously when it comes to drugs. Crack cocaine obviously comes to mind. And now we're talking about fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, and again, not wanting to head in that same direction. So can you talk a little bit about class-wide scheduling and how it undercuts these goals around bipartisan criminal legal reform that we've had some success with to date?
Yeah, certainly. And thank you, Kanya and Grant and Patricia. Thanks for having me on. And Sakira, it's good to see you again. It's been a while. Hope you're doing well. I was reminded of the challenges that we faced just last week when the House Crime Subcommittee held a hearing on federal policies and enforcement related to controlled substances. It had the potential to be a bipartisan discussion. Unfortunately, the Republican minority really didn't engage on the merits of the discussion at all, such as the very real racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Instead, they spent much of their time discussing immigration and the border, very stereotypical, but rather boring at the end of the day. Almost every buzzword was mentioned at some point, either by Republican members or by their witness, who happened to be a former DEA agent. I even heard one Republican member of the subcommittee speak positively about drug dealer liability laws in his home state. We know that these laws do little more than target dealers who are the easiest to replace, and they don't do anything to stop the flow of drugs in communities. I'm 40, and it's been referenced already that the drug war has gone on for 40 years. It existed in some form even before then, but we know that the war on drugs has been a failure. Yet here we are fighting the same battles because too many have refused to recognize that addiction is a public health issue. Some may recall the 1997 movie, The Lost World. If you haven't seen it, it's on TV almost every weekend. I'm sure you can find it on some station. In which the eccentric Jurassic Park creator John Hammond, who wants to send a team to an island to observe dinosaurs, tells Ian Malcolm, "I'm not making the same mistakes again." To which Malcolm replies, "No, you're making all new ones." The same could be said of us as we approach this new phase of the war on drugs. Class-wide scheduling undercuts the goals of bipartisan criminal legal reform and criminal justice reform by denying proper defense, due process, and it also has a lot of mens rea concerns, as Sakira mentioned, in terms of intent. This includes punishment of individuals who lack criminal intent and punishment of individuals for substances that have not been evaluated by scientists to establish that it even meets the criteria for Schedule 1. Potency and purity are also extremely varied across fentanyl analogs, yet the mandatory sentence is the same. Penalties for fentanyl are already very harsh and have been since the 1980s. They're among the most severe mandatory minimums for drugs, if not the most severe. But this has not deterred or stopped illicit fentanyl from coming into communities. There are thousands of federal criminal laws on the books. We should be focusing on reducing overcriminalization rather than expanding the net of criminalization, in this case for drugs. One of the issues also, this is kind of a separate, but still one I'm very passionate about, it's Article 1, the separation of powers. Far too many lawmakers, Democratic and Republican alike, are willing to surrender their power to executive agencies. This is problematic no matter what the policy area is, whether it's trade, war powers, or class-wide scheduling. And that's because class-wide scheduling concentrates power within one federal agency, the Department of Justice, and one person, the Attorney General, who would have unilateral power to add substances to the federal schedule and set penalties accordingly. The Attorney General should not, no matter which party that Attorney General belongs to, should not be granted broad power to schedule chemical substances. And not to mention the fact that we also have extreme costs that come with it, and that's perhaps an answer for a different question, but we should be focusing on this as a public health issue, not one related to incarceration and furthering those significant racial disparities that exist in our criminal justice system. And as someone who's made his career on the center right side of the aisle, and working predominantly with Republican offices, I do wish more Republican offices would recognize and acknowledge that those disparities exist and that the war on drugs has been a failure for more than 40 years.
Thank you for that, Jason. And we will certainly come back to you and try to figure out how we get more Republicans to the table, how we get all members to engage with us here. I want to turn to Patricia. As I shared at the start, Patricia Richman is largely responsible for getting us all here today assembled for this discussion. She's the National Sentencing Resource Council with the Federal Public and Community Defenders, where she leads legislative and policy work. Previously, Patricia served as a detailee to the Judiciary Committee for U.S. Senator Richard Durbin, who is now chairing that committee. And she is also a former assistant federal public defender in Maryland. So Patricia, I think the perspective that you're bringing to this conversation is so important. Obviously, you've done advocacy on the Hill, and you continue to do that now for the federal defenders, but you have practiced, and you know that as a defender and as a system actor, that criminalizing fentanyl is much more than the conversation we're having, today in the symposium and the back and forth that lawmakers are going to have when they try to figure out next steps. So you've experienced clients, many of them low-level offenders, people of color, or people in need of substance use treatment who have felt the brunt of a prison over public health approach to fentanyl. So I think it really benefits this audience to hear sort of what the due process, liberty, and other real-world implications of class-wide scheduling look like, what it looks like.
Thank you so much, Kanya, and I really appreciate everybody's participation today. This has been such a great gathering to participate in today. And a lot of what it means to be an individual moving through the criminal justice system is feeling the brunt of extreme prosecutorial power, the brunt of the power of the government brought to bear. And class-wide scheduling doubles down on this power. It unnecessarily expands the DEA and Department of Justice's authority in a way that truly undermines core notions of fairness. So as an initial matter, we have to recognize that the Trump administration's push for class-wide scheduling has rested on two oft-repeated false claims. One, there's a gap or a loophole in law enforcement tools impeding the government's ability to prosecute these cases, their ability to seize these substances. The other one is that without class-wide scheduling, harmful fentanyl analogs would be legalized. And as Bill Barr said in his infamous op-ed last year, legalized poison, a tsunami of legalized poison would flood the country. Both of these claims, repeated often, are untrue. What we know is that DOJ and DEA mostly prosecute analogs that have been individually scheduled. Individually scheduled, as you heard in some of the earlier panels today, individually scheduled substances can be swiftly controlled by the DEA, but there's a backstop of scientific and medical evaluation before that control is made permanent to ensure that that substance has no potential for abuse, that it has no therapeutic benefit. For the rest, the remaining handful of cases, the Department of Justice can use the Analog Act. Now, the Department of Justice complains a lot about the Analog Act being unwieldy and burdensome, although at the same time, it's acknowledged a good track record on these cases. But the burdens associated with the Analog Act exist for a reason. The Analog Act is the government's tool to prosecute substances that DEA and DOJ have decided are harmful, but nobody else has confirmed that yet. It's right for the government to carry a higher burden when they seek to bring the harsh federal penalties to bear against an individual for a substance that potentially no scientist or expert has concluded would be helpful. In any case, I've asked federal defender offices across the country about whether they've had battles of the experts or inconsistent court outcomes in fentanyl analog cases, and I haven't learned about that happening. So in criminal prosecutions, government attorneys have to prove each element of an offense beyond a reasonable doubt. Why is that the case? Because we live in a country that errs on the side of protecting innocence, or at least purports to. William Blackstone wrote, "Better that 10 guilty persons escape than one innocent suffer." And together, the Analog Act and Controlled Substances Act require that someone other than the Department of Justice confirm a substance's potential for abuse. But class-wide scheduling eliminates those checks against overcriminalization and overreach. It relieves the government of its burden to prove that novel substances are harmful and eliminates the opportunity for medical and science institutions to weigh in, all using an approach, a structure-based approach that's not supported by science. And we know that the number of substances criminalized by this approach is unknown. We know they're going to range in potency from harmful to inert. But under class-wide control, any of these substances would be subject to criminal prosecution, even if the substance has no potential for abuse. And for those who say that these concerns are hypothetical, I will tell you, there are already examples of this occurring. The Sentencing Commission in their recent report found that 2.1% of fentanyl analog cases it looked at involved benzofentanyl, which is a substance that has been known to have no potential for abuse, no effect in the human body since 1986. If class-wide scheduling becomes permanent, prosecutors are going to have no incentive to determine whether or not substance has abuse potential. And even if they were incentivized to do that, they don't have the tools to do it. Obviously, Kanya, criminalizing substances with no potential for abuse poses significant implications for fundamental fairness.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I think we all really benefited from sort of hearing how this plays out in the real world, what the practical implications are for people. We certainly need to understand through humanizing this issue what's at stake here. You talked a lot about sort of what happens when we ignore our medical and science institutions, when we sort of leave them out of the policy making here. And so, Jasmine, I want to go back to you, following up on some of what you shared at the start of this conversation about the need to really take a public health approach here, why it is critical that we have, medicine and science sort of, at the table as stakeholders, figuring out how we move forward. So can you talk a bit about sort of what that looks like? In New York, what is it that you see happening when those stakeholders are not at the table? And how are you going forward from there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So yeah, I just want to echo a couple of points that have been repeated over and over again, I think, throughout this whole entire panel, is the increase of criminalization has no impact on the overdose crisis. It will not reduce overdose deaths. It will not reduce fentanyl in our communities. It will not reduce, all it will increase is mass incarceration. And so currently in New York State, fentanyl really is in a lot of our drug supply. So it's in meth, crack, cocaine, benzos. It's really in everything right now. And overdoses are surging, like I said before. Shantae, who was on the very first panel, talks a lot about how it's been so hard to get people to call 911 in the event of an overdose, and how much education and years of education it took to make people feel comfortable doing that. And now there's a lot of fear in New York City. Now, when you call 911, all overdoses are crime scenes, right? So fatal or non. And so as we look at if we have our drug supply is toxic right now, and we have criminalization all over the place, kind of creeping in, and then we have this federal ban that could potentially be permanent, it's really concerning about what that looks like on the ground. And it's very Vocal also runs a syringe exchange program. And I can tell you that a lot of our folks refused to call 911, refused to go to emergency rooms after an overdose, et cetera, because of the fear of the police state around drug use. And And so the solutions really, right, if we're really looking at like, how do we turn the tide on the overdose crisis and save lives and start to de-incarcerate folks and start to like take apart and dismantle the drug war, it's absolutely about looking at what works. And we know that evidence has been around for a very long time on things that work. And as you all have said on this panel, the drug war doesn't. It only works to do what it was designed to do, which was to lock up Black and brown people and poor people. And so medication-assisted treatment, right, like works if we can make sure that it's accessible, that barriers are removed, both at the federal and the state level, that we're meeting people everywhere we can, where they're at, you know, and ensuring that too is not being criminalized or police state wise. So universal access to medication-assisted treatment is really critical. I also think, you know, overdose prevention centers, also known as safer injecting facilities or safer consumption spaces, depending on where you're at in the country, absolutely will work to not only one, keep people alive, right, as overdoses are surging, but two, connect people to care, as well as provide spaces and places where people can test their drugs and also connect with people, care of like getting connected to housing services, et cetera, et cetera. I think, you know, if we're talking about fentanyl in general and that like we have fentanyl really in a lot of our supply, we should be expanding access to drug checking as much as possible and expanding it in the community, expanding it at harm reduction centers, expanding it as much as possible. I've been pushing really hard at the New York City level to get fentanyl testing strips in vending machines across the city. That is a way that we can really talk about like, hey, if you're going to use, we need you to be safe. Here's some naloxone, you know, check your drugs, and we're here if you need us, right? These are solutions that are not rooted in like getting people or harming people, right? They're rooted in evidence, they're rooted in compassion and science that shows, you know, if we combine a lot of these many of different tools to keep people alive, keep them safe, and keep them, you know, continue to offer them compassion and dignity, then we can turn the tide, right? But like, if we continue down the road that has failed since its inception, it's just going to be more harm and more death. So those are some of the solutions.
Thank you so much for that, Jasmine. I think those are exactly the solutions that we need to be exploring. I want to be mindful of the time. I know we have just a few minutes left, so I want us to be very solutions oriented in sort of what we offer now to the audience and sort of the charge that we want to provide with them. So, you know, Sakira, quickly, you know, do you have a reaction to what Jasmine is sharing? She has shared sort of what the public health approach looks like in New York. You know, how do we get the federal government to make those investments? And, you know, your response can talk about substance, but it can also talk about tactics, just sort of who all will we need at the table to get the investment that we need in health as opposed to the DEA.
Well, first, I mean, obviously, I agree with everything Jasmine said, and really commend Local New York for the amazing work that they're doing on this issue. And so happy that, you know, folks on the Hill are able to hear from this very local perspective, because I think it really will provide some color to what, for many of them, is sort of a, you know, an exercise in theory in many respects. Unfortunately, it tends to be that way at the federal level, is that people don't provide the practical experience of what actually is happening on the ground in the context of policymaking. So that's super important. And everything that Jasmine is talking about, the federal government can play a role in, right? They can incentivize this public health approach through their funding mechanisms and through the supports that they lend to states to tackle these crises. Instead, they are attempting to take the opposite approach, the approach that, you know, as Jason so notably, you know, said, with respect to making new mistakes, right, based on a failed war on drugs, that's what we are setting ourselves up to do. But we have an opportunity here, right? This approach was the approach of the Trump administration. Unfortunately, they were trying to take this different approach. We are in a new administration. We're in an administration that has said they believe in abolishing all mandatory minimums. So if you believe in abolishing all mandatory minimums, you should understand the connectivity between you know, a class-wide scheduling of this type of drug that will necessarily implicate mandatory minimums, that will increase prosecutions, that will drive and incentivize prosecuting these types of drugs as counter to your policy position around mandatory minimums. Like that in and of itself is a contradiction. And so it is really imperative for this administration to think about this issue, as Jasmine has posited, as a pure public health crisis, as a way to educate not only policymakers about the approach, why we should take a public health approach, why what the DEA is saying is not actually accurate and incorrect, and only a tool to incite more hysteria, to incite more criminalization, because that's the DEA's job, Drug Enforcement Agency. That's what it stands for, right? That is their only job. So they are not thinking about this from a perspective of, let's help people. No, their job is not to help. Their job is to put people behind bars. Their job is to continue to use the tools that they've been given to fill the prisons. And so we can't think that we're going to be able to charge an enforcement agency like the DEA with the you know, unfettered power to be, you know, addressing this crisis, right? Because the only tools that they know how to use are the hammer. The only tools that they know how to use are the sticks, right? Prosecution. So no, we actually need to think about, which is why scheduling is a process that involves scientists at HHS. We actually need to be thinking about, no, what is the pharmacological makeup? What will the impact of this drug be on someone's body? And then once we understand that, how do we educate people? How do we steer people away from its use? How do we remove stigma, right? Jasmine talked a lot about stigma and the fact that people are afraid because of the loom of enforcement, are afraid to take this approach. So we charge, I think everyone on this panel would agree that we are charging policymakers across the political spectrum to pull back the veil of the past and open their eyes to the present and the future. In this administration, to really chart a new course, a course that is based and rooted in evidence and science and public health of everyone and the benefit of all. And that is what we need to be doing today. And that is what we're charging all of you who are watching this, to go back to your members, to go back to your communities and think through, and to work with us to do. And so I'll turn it over to Patricia and Jason. Sorry, Kanya.
Thanks, Sakira. No, we have just a minute. And Jason, I saw you nodding your head. And so, you know, in a minute, I am hoping that you can sort of agree with the charge that Sakira has laid out for us, and sort of what you're going to do to make sure that we have a, you know, diverse, bipartisan coalition moving us forward in this space. And then, you know, after you do that in 1 minute, Patricia, I want to make sure you take us home and really give us this call to action for lawmakers, for staffs who are wrestling with these issues.
I'll say that the only thing in my career in Washington, D.C., and I've been doing this now for a little bit over 6 years as a second career, the stuff that I've felt the best about has been bipartisan work. And it's the stuff that I've been able to talk about with friends and brag about at home. You know, that's the stuff I've felt good about. And whether it's passing the First Step Act or stopping surveillance, protecting the Fourth Amendment, those are the things that I want to continue to work on. So that means working with you, Kanya, means working with Sakira, means working with anybody else, whether they're right or left. I don't particularly give a damn what ideology you have, as long as we're getting something good done. So that's the approach I've had, and that's the approach I'm going to continue to have as I work on the Hill under a new banner at the Due Process Institute.
Thank you, Jason. We are excited to have you there. And Patricia, tell us how, as Jason said, we get this something done. How do we get it done?
Thank you, Kanya. What I would say to that is let's choose this moment to not repeat the mistakes of the past. When the need to do something overrides making sure that it's the right thing, the results are catastrophic. Now here, Congress hit pause, despite the fear tactics of the Trump administration that were designed to pressure them to permanently adopt class-wide scheduling and to double down on an enforcement first response. They had the fortitude to push back and extend it temporarily by only a year. And they are asking, and we are asking, two key questions that I think have been answered here today. Will class-wide scheduling stop overdose deaths? Will class-wide scheduling reduce the supply of harmful substances in our country? The answer is a resounding no. Today we have heard from the scientists, class-wide scheduling is a sledgehammer where a scalpel would do. It is overbroad. It will criminalize harmful and helpful substances alike. Scientists are warning, just as they did 34 years ago when the Analog Act was written, that blanket bans of substances hurt science and may delay or eliminate the discovery of badly needed antidotes, treatments, and therapeutics. We should listen to them now as we listened to them then. When Congress wrote the Controlled Substance Act, it gave science and medicine an equal voice in drug control to prevent precisely this scenario. Today, we heard from impacted people, from public defenders, from advocates, that even without class-wide scheduling, prosecutors have aggressively brought war on drug tactics to bear in fentanyl analog prosecutions. We need to address that problem, not expand their authority, because we've heard that communities will continue to be destroyed, children will continue to be separated from their parents, and our tax dollars will continue to fuel excessive punishment if we stay this course. Punishment will not deter. It will only fuel fear that will keep people from seeking help. And from public health experts today, you heard that overdose deaths have been and will continue to rise. And even if there is a shift away from fentanyl analogs, it will be to something more potent, more harmful. The cycle is going to continue unabated. We cannot allow lies and disinformation from the Trump era to dictate today's policy. Science matters. Due process and liberty is not a mere inconvenience to sweep aside. We have to embrace science, evidence, and reason. Here, that means we have to let class-wide scheduling expire. And it means, as Representative Cori Bush said at the hearing Jason mentioned last week, that we have to roll up our sleeves and we have to do the work. We need to get into the community and start implementing evidence-based, science-first solutions that are proven to reduce demand, reduce overdose deaths, and that can start to heal our communities and country. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you today, and thank you all for gathering. This has been a terrific conversation.
Thank you so much, Patricia.
So I just want to close out the program by saying thank you to everybody. The speakers were just absolutely amazing. And as is often the case, even 4 hours is not enough time to cover all the dynamic issues that are here. I especially want to give thanks to Patricia Richman and Grant Smith for inviting all the panelists, and an extra double thanks to Yana Herdnova and Holly Griffin for doing an extraordinary job keeping us all on time and putting all the infrastructure together so you could hear from this incredible group of individuals talking about this real pressing issue. The Drug Enforcement and Policy Center was created a few years ago in part because there just hasn't been a dedicated space in the academy to talk about these issues on a consistent basis. And we are always eager to partner with any group, with any set of individuals to elevate the discourse here, this conversation, the science, and the advocacy perspectives were so spectacular. And I would just be grateful for any other partnerships along these lines. It was terrific to work with all of you, and incredibly grateful that we can keep moving forward, putting science over fear, as our title suggested. So thank you all for spending the time today. As mentioned before, the recordings will be made available soon, and please feel free to reach out to any of us for any follow-up. Thanks so much and have a great afternoon.